Thanks for having me here. This is my first time actually giving a talk to the graduate group. I was sort of watched it form over the years, so it's fun to be here. I'm hoping to learn a lot from you all as well. The first thing I was asked to do is talk a little bit about my career path. So I'll go ahead and do that. Just try to not spend too long on it, but maybe just pick up on a couple of themes. So I'm trained as an engineer. My PhD was engineering and applied math, not in energy. I didn't work in energy for my PhD, but you'll see this. I'll say this a few times. I tried to really balance things that I was deeply curious about with things that I thought had potential for societal impact. And so that's maybe like a quick synopsis of how I addressed my training. So after my PhD, though, I felt like really pulled toward the societal impact part of things much more than the curiosity side of things. And so I worked in industry for a while, and as Alyssa mentioned, actually my first like real job was working at Davis Energy Group, which has been purchased and is no longer under that name, but it was just right on 123 C Street here in Davis. I spent a long time working there and was actually involved in the early stages of the Western Cooling Efficiency Center, like the first proposal for that when I was at PG&E. I worked at Powerlight Corporation doing solar power design engineering for a little bit, but then the curiosity part kind of got a hold of me again, and I felt like, I want to have a little bit more intellectual freedom. So I moved back into academics, not really knowing where it would take me. And the academics at first was a research faculty position, as Alyssa mentioned. That's when I was at the University of Michigan. And it took some time, I say here, to identify my identity, like my academic identity. And it's one of the sort of challenges, I think, you all are probably in a similar situation where you're in this like interdisciplinary, well, we all like energy, but what else? How do we actually ground ourselves? If I have a discipline, what is it? And it took some time for me to figure that one out. And I will say there was a fair bit of luck involved in actually kind of figuring it out for sure. But it was, I'll go back to sort of crediting the curiosity part, just like figuring out, what am I excited about? What am I really, what am I going to be thinking about, enjoying thinking about, even if I'm not actively at work? And so it can be hard to find that thing sometimes. So then this kind of filters through then how I choose research problems to work on. It's balancing that curiosity and impact. So electricity, infrastructure, and society, it's hard to not find places where impact is large. And I am personally deeply interested in just the technical details of electric power systems. So it's been a really fun place to be for me. Another thing I'll say is so teaching is a really important part of my job, and how I approach that is, I see decarbonization as one of the fundamental things that that I'm trying to facilitate in my career. And I think that teaching, there's a foundational knowledge required for and technical skills that are required for students to be kind of agents of change and decarbonization. And so I try to approach all the topics that I teach with that perspective. And most importantly, though, I'll say, and I hope you all do it today, but I want students to learn to ask good questions and to not be afraid to assemble the resources to answer them. And sometimes that means you can't answer them right away, and that's what's fun about research. So I'll just say a couple of other things on my career path. What's mattered the most? I'm saying it again, it's this balance of curiosity and impact. And I think one way that I think about it is that because I'm intellectually interested in the things that I work on, and I'm curious, just sort of generally curious about things, that's what kind of keeps me going on a daily basis. It's I get up in the morning, I'm like, I want to figure this thing out, it's fun, I want to learn more. But then it's the weeks and the months where it's it's got potential for impact. So I can kind of add things up, think in those ways. I will definitely say I was in the right place at the right time. From my perspective, when I think about like how my career has progressed, like I found myself getting interested in electricity and electric power systems when research in that space was pretty dusty. Like people weren't really, it wasn't much of a place to be academically at that point, but it just started ramping up when I got engaged. And so, you know, I was lucky, but luck favors the well-prepared. Maybe you've heard that before. So like get yourself in the right position and eventually the cards fall in your favor. Also, I can't say enough about the people that I've been able to interact with and really inspiring mentors. I think, you know, what I would say to you in terms of thinking about my own career path here is like, it can take time to find those people. They don't just kind of show up. So you've got to sort of be active in finding the people that you can connect with and call your mentors. But it's absolutely critical. And then the other thing on people that I'll say is that it's a real privilege of my job that I get to work with just incredible students. I'll say, okay, a couple more like maybe more philosophical things about my career path. I think it's for me, it's been very important to have a purpose, you know, to feel like, okay, my purpose, the short statement is paving the path for decarbonization through teaching and research. And that's the like years time scale, you know, when I think about like, okay, what am I doing? Why am I keeping at this? It's for that purpose. And then the last thing I'll say is that for me, it's been really important to have interests outside of academics for my own career path. And I just sort of recently realized this. It's interests that don't force me to judge myself. Like I'm constantly judging myself in my job, and to have things that just sort of bring you joy that are not your job, and you're not kind of evaluating how well you're doing it. For a long time, I was a bike racer and I was like, which position am I in getting across the finish line? It's like, you know, enough of that. It's just like, find the things that just bring you joy. Okay, that's my career talk. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit then about, I just want to do like a little bit more background stuff. I have a research group I call Energy Modeling, Analysis, and Control at UC Berkeley, and it's a housed in Energy and Resources group, which is sort of like the GG of Berkeley. And we've got undergraduate, graduate students, postdocs, and myself as the PI. And you know, I try to pull, or I'm open at least to sort of pulling students from all over campus, but in particular ERG and electrical engineering and computer science. And here is this, you know, paving the path for decarbonization part. So it's research and innovation to support decarbonization. And I put our research category, I categorize it. I try not to silo it too much, but sometimes it's easy to describe things in terms of energy analysis and engineering solutions. So the energy analysis is techno-economics, thinking about cost and performance of energy systems and technologies, thinking about future scenarios, and today's talk will be a lot about energy analysis. Whereas engineering solutions, sometimes they're informed by the energy analysis, where we're developing algorithms or control tools or optimization tools to improve how the electric grid operates. So I try to cultivate these two things together. It's a way that keeps me curious, but also I think there's some merit in kind of bringing them together so that folks that are doing the more analytical work realize, well, it's got to be something that's solvable. The folks that are doing the solutions work realize, well, it's something that's got to come from a real need on the analysis side. All right, now I'll start finally talking about today's talk and the grid. So you all may have seen figures like this before, where when you think about the electricity system, people often partition it into generation, transmission, and distribution. And if we think about decarbonization, a lot of the emphasis right now is decarbonize the grid and get more things to consume electricity instead of burning natural gas or burning gasoline or diesel. And so there's been a lot of emphasis thinking about, well, how do we support that on the generation side? battery storage, what solar PV assets, how do we make it so that the supply side itself is low carbon? There's a lot of emphasis on transmission systems as well. Like, where do we need to build new transmission? How do we operate the grid at large scales so that it can support all of this new generation? But today's talk, and it's kind of takes up the bigger part of the figure here, is on distribution systems, which have received less attention. And I'll get into some of the reasons why, but right now I just want to kind of establish some terminology. So when you think about the purpose of a distribution system, it's like the side streets versus transmission being the highways of the grid. And typically what happens is you step a voltage down from a high voltage on the transmission side to what we call a distribution level voltage. It's still not a voltage that you could want to interact with. Like every once in a while, maybe you accidentally feel 110 volts, but you still don't want to touch that voltage. That's like kilovolts. It's going to be very dangerous. But it's sufficiently low that you can put the poles closer to the ground. You can have protection equipment that can, we can feel confident that it's going to, for the most part, keep people safe and avoid wildfire ignitions, although not always. And then we finally step those voltages down to what we call utilization, where people consume and do their energy using activities. So today's focus is on what needs to happen to support decarbonization on the distribution side. So here's just a roadmap. I'm going to do it in two parts. The first part, more brief. I'm going to talk about a paper that Anna Brockway, my student, who's now at Southern California Edison, was the lead author on, where we wanted to understand who has capacity for distributed energy resources, for installing distributed energy resources on their premises. And I'll talk about kind of how we get into that. And then the second part, I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about how specific measures for electrification, like space heating, water heating, transportation electrification, how that's specifically going to impact distribution infrastructure and what it implies for the work ahead. So this slide, before I get into the meat of those two parts, just sets up one of the real workhorses of all of the work that I'm talking about today and the data that we use. So ICA stands for Integration Capacity Analysis. And these are the output. ICA analyses get output by all three of our major investor-owned utilities in California: PG&E, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And the purpose of the ICA maps, it comes out of rulemaking from the California Public Utilities Commission, is that they're intended to inform and identify distributed energy resource growth constraints in the planning process, to identify when and where capacity upgrades are needed on the distribution meter as a result of various scenarios. So this is a map, okay, so this is the UC Berkeley campus right here, and you can see the level of spatial detail. Right here is just color coded, saying green means there's lots of capacity. Looking at here, in this case, it's for new electric load. Lots of capacity for new load, and red on the other side means steer clear. If you put new electric load there, there's going to be an overload and an upgrade needed. I think I have, yeah, I put this in this morning. So I don't know if we have, I think we're probably over here. Is this Hutchison? I'm not sure. So here, just an example, it's in PG&E, it's its entire service territory. We've got this really fine spatial resolution mapping. And the cool thing that we realized, I'll point here, is this little button right there. Download spatial data. For a long time, you actually couldn't download it. We were working with it, doing all these crazy things and trying to make it work. But then eventually we got these geospatial files that tell a whole lot of information, not just these colors, about PG&E's estimates for the status of its distribution systems to accommodate various kinds of distributed energy resources. So this is going to be a really important part of all the analysis that I talk about today. Okay, I'm gonna do an animation here that it's not meant to overwhelm you. It's just meant to sort of give you a sense for the complexity of the data that we're working with. Okay, so this is just an example of the kind of output that we get. So these, each column here is like a different feeder. So if I passed over this. So when you think about a substation is the thing that interfaces with the transmission system, and then we have what people will call radial lines. It's like one sort of non-looped distribution feeder that leaves that substation and goes and serves customers. And a feeder might serve something like 1,000 customers, maybe 3,000, maybe a few hundred. It depends really on the location. So here, each one of these is actually a segment of a feeder. And we have that sort of level of information. And then each one of these rows is representing a different type of engineering constraint on the system. And then what you can see is by month, hour, right? So we've got hourly, we've got months shown here, and then within each month, you can't really see it, but there's going to be like a 24-hour cycle. And that's saying how much of, in this case, I think again, we're looking at new load, new electricity load can show up on these feeders before PG&E would say it's overloaded, we need to upgrade. So it's just like a ton of spatial resolution and temporal data and kind of different engineering data. And so all of this stuff kind of gets pulled together in the analysis. Okay, so let's do part one, who has grid capacity. This will be a little bit shorter than part two. So but please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Okay, so yeah, question?
Yeah, so the ICMFs. Can you interpolate the size of the distribution transformer at the end of the feeder based on the feeder size? So like on the I've played with the ICMFs before, and I know it's like it stops and there's a little dot, 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 and that's like, that is the line from the distribution transformer to like the…
Right.
Are you able to do that, or is that not a possible thing, or like the maximum, or what would it need to be based on the feeder size?
Okay, so just to clarify for everybody else who hasn't like spent their lives looking at these maps, if you think about this high voltage that I was talking about, this is in the kilovolt range, it's eventually stepped down so that we can use it in our buildings with what we call a secondary distribution transformer. It's not put on the map. And the question is, can we infer anything about those secondary distribution transformers from these data? And I am not aware of a way that you could do it. It's possible, we haven't really thought about it. I will talk about a study toward the end where they've actually had the data on those transformers. But I think I think things are so idiosyncratic that I wouldn't try to infer just from these data what those secondary distribution
If you had the AMI data from the home,
even then,
because you have start end, and you can figure out roughly the middle.
Yeah. No, well, you could figure out the minimum amount of capacity that there is on that transformer, but not the maximum. Okay. All right. Other questions? Okay. So distributed energy resources, I should have defined it at the beginning, but you could think of that as like solar photovoltaics on somebody's roof, batteries, but also new, this is starting to fit in here, is also something like an electric vehicle. Or even possibly some people would even put in there like electrified loads like heat pumps or water heaters. So this slide is actually just going to focus on solar photovoltaics. And this is just background, kind of the state of things when we started doing this work was that folks were recognizing that they were talking about a clean energy transition. Maybe you've heard people talk about just transitions. And transitions, whenever there's sort of a big shift in infrastructure and society, there's very likely to be winners and losers. And other researchers around the same time had also been noting that, well, when we think about winners with DER and especially solar photovoltaics, the households that have already adopted solar photovoltaics are more white, less disadvantaged as measured by calorie screen, and wealthier. Some of those inequities in terms of who's adopting can be traced to the fact that you need to own your home to put solar on your roof typically, but even after controlling for that, a lot of these inequities still persist. So our question, kind of how Anna Brockway, my student, framed it is, well, what about can we do anything to look toward the future? So like people would like to try to address those inequities with different policy levers, bringing costs down. Are there infrastructure issues that could make it so that there are still some obstacles to future adoption? That's like the core question if you wanted to understand. Okay, so this slide is meant to give you a summary of like the nature of the geospatial analysis that we were doing. So again, we're leveraging these ICA maps where in this case, we looked at both PG&E and Southern California Edison, and we looked at just as opposed to the next part of the talk, in this part, we just looked at their own assessment, PG&E and SCE's own assessments of how much solar photovoltaics could show up on their grids, or how much new electrical load could show up on their grids. And so just to sort of give you a sense of the spatial richness, like this kind of pale green area is PG&E service territory, the pale reddish area is Southern California Edison. Each one of these little polygons is a census block group where we can get information about, you know, educational level, incomes, race and ethnicity, and so on. And then if you look over here, then you can see we overlay those maps that we have from the utilities. And so we did this approach where we just said, okay, for each one of the distribution feeders, we're gonna say whichever, if you pick a point in space, whichever feeder it's closest to, we're just gonna make a rough assumption that that point in space is served by the feeder. So here, for example, you can see like if you choose that point in space, we're gonna associate that point in space with this feeder, but if you're just across this line, we're gonna associate with that feeder. And that's using something called a Voronoi tessellation. It's just a fancy way of saying choose the closest point. And so then we can overlay those kind of feeder service territories with those census block groups and start to understand what are the demographic characteristics of the people that are served by those feeders, and how do the utility assessments of how much new capacity there is for DER potentially correlate to some of those characteristics. So the first thing that I'll say, before even looking at the correlation with the census data, we just asked, okay, how much capacity is there? And we used just a benchmark. We said, okay, what if we have a policy goal? And I'm not advocating this policy goal, I'm just saying, suppose there's a policy goal of everybody having the average size solar photovoltaic system needed to offset all of your electricity consumption over a year. That's about 4.5 kilowatts in California. If we ask, okay, now how much capacity do all of those feeders in PG&E and SCE have? Just about 60% of households don't have enough capacity to have a system of that size. So it's just kind of like gives you a benchmark for how much capacity there is according to these utility estimates. Now if we say, yeah, go ahead.
A quick question about, so you start with their reporting.
Yes.
And now we are not talking about the loads, the base loads yet. Is it,
Yes.
we just talk about the hardware? Is that correct? Or
Well, and I want to emphasize, I don't know if you were trying to emphasize this point, but I do want to continue emphasizing this, that the limitation, in a way, of the study is that we are forced to work with assessments that come from the utilities.
So
Now, on the other hand, there's no place else where one could sort of collect this kind of information than in well, there are a few places like New York. There's some assessments. But it is I think it's still an important caveat. But at the same time, I think it's worth interrogating and using it to think about like what the next steps are. But go ahead.
So I think that's what I'm asking. You don't have the hardware specification. You have their assessment of what their hardware can do.
Yes.
In a way.
Yes.
And are the PUC specifications strong enough that you know that, for example, what PG&E is estimating, if someone else will go through the analysis and run it on the same set of feeders and so on, will they come with the same numbers, or may they come with different?
I think they almost surely have different numbers, and that's just because like simulation and engineering is not always super clean. You know, are they? Is there? I get one question I suppose you could ask: is there a reason that we should not trust
Oh,
that these are sort of best. Yes, but like,
Don't
what
get
are the
there.
incentives in this specific case? Like, there have certainly been, like, the data have evolved quite a lot over the years. And there have been a lot of, there's been a lot of scrutiny on the nature of what these ICA data sort of imply, and there have been a lot of updates from the utilities to try to improve a lot of those concerns. I think there are a lot of places where I'm uncomfortable with the like investor and utility regulator kind of incentives and relationship. On this one, I feel pretty comfortable trusting that the engineers are doing their best job, but it's trust for sure. Okay, so if we think about who has yet to install solar PV according to these data, then it's an even higher number. It's almost 3/4 of households that have not yet installed solar PV that do not have sufficient capacity according to these estimates. Okay, so now let me just like quickly talk a little bit about the spatial heterogeneity. The main takeaway I want you to get from this map is these sort of borders, and that you can, if we think about it here, if you look at this legend, this is saying there's 10 or more kilowatts of capacity per customer in this region, whereas over here, there's 0 to 1.5 kilowatts of capacity. And so just by moving from one feeder to another, there can be these really big shifts in how much capacity is there. And so then our question was, okay, we see that there's strong spatial heterogeneity in available capacity. We know that there's strong spatial heterogeneity in who lives where. The question is, are there any trends in terms of the overlay and the correlation between those? So what we find, and this is a trend that, how do I want to say this? This is not like a hard rule, but on average, what one sees is that communities of color and communities that are disadvantaged per the Callan-Myers screen spatial mapping tool are less likely to have sufficient capacity for new solar photovoltaics or new electric load per these maps. Okay, why is that? We don't know. This is just correlation. We're not trying to look at a causal story. We have a couple of hypotheses that one could potentially explore going further, but we don't have the data to test it. So one is simply that historic upgrades in the distribution system have been made in places to accommodate where the solar photovoltaics have been built. We know the solar photovoltaics are getting built on more often on white and high income homeowning communities. And so one sees then that there is more capacity, even further capacity in those regions. It may also be that it just has to do with where there is growth in new load, taking the PV aside. Suburban areas where there's going to be more and more buildings connecting to the grid. As the utilities sort of build out their grid, they build it with the anticipation of that need for capacity in the future. Those tend to be wealthier communities, white communities. Okay, so, but these are strong speculations, and we don't have the ability to actually test that. But I still think that there's important implications just to the correlation. And the first is that, so just an observation, utilities, and I'll get to this in a little bit more detail in the second part. Utilities will keep making grid upgrades for new DER as long as they're able to, and as long as regulators allow them to charge their customers to recover the cost of making these upgrades. But there's this able to part, like, will the pace of needed upgrades be adequate to support people if they wish to install new distributed energy resources? I'll really get into detail on this in the second part of the talk. But I think the important part here, the way that I think about it, is that if these conditions are met, then there is a need for substantial expansion per these maps. And it requires grid upgrades that will require time and money. And until those conditions are met, customers may face interconnection delays. And this is actually pretty well documented, and I'll talk about a new just signed into law bill that attempts to address this at the end of the talk. But so I see that there's two issues here. One is that going forward, if communities are going to continue putting distributed energy resources at the customer premises, there's certain communities that will disproportionately be facing interconnection delays. And I think that there's important questions just about cost, like what communities will be bearing the cost of those upgrades. I'm not saying that those communities will bear the cost, but depending on the paths that we take, they could. So where have we gone from here? I just want to talk a little bit about like what we've done with this research in terms of outreach, the more sort of public service oriented side of things. So the key thing that Anna and I have talked about is the importance of thinking about if we're going to pursue, especially with solar photovoltaics, something like net energy metering policies that enable customers to have the benefits of solar photovoltaic production on their retail bills, that tying those benefits to location is potentially problematic. And so we've just tried to argue as part of an outgrowth of this work in some op-eds and in responses to PUC and public comments to the California PUC's plans, that we need to look harder at these so-called community solar approaches where customers can benefit from a well-sited solar facility, benefit from it in the same ways using these net energy metering tariffs. If that's the policy, that if we decide that we want to continue having customers get the benefits of a net energy metering policy. Okay, question.
Yeah, the one of the last slide where you presented two different hypotheses for why. How does energy efficiency figure into that, and whether or not homes, right, in predominantly white wealthy areas, actually they've just been benefited more from energy efficiency programs, and homes in those other locations have not. So there's actually like there's two effects. There's one is they get more solar, so they upgrade it, but also the buildings in those areas are just more energy efficient. So therefore they've just lowered the floor, and so there's more headroom on the capacity versus in other places that have not benefited from, because maybe they're not homeowners, they're renters. Like at the end of the day, they just IOUs did not pay attention.
I think the effect would actually go the other way. Thinking on my feet here, but if we're talking specifically about solar PV, the issue is reverse flow.
Well, right? No, I'm talking about additional capacity for like electrification. So for load, not for generation.
It's possible. We haven't thought about that. Okay. All right. Any other questions before I go to part two? All right. How am I on time? When should I wrap up?
We usually wrap up around 11:30 or a little bit after.
Okay.
And then time for questions.
Okay. All right. I suspect that this kind of rationale is something that you all are pretty comfortable with. I mentioned this before. There's a big push nationwide and globally, but also in California, to electrify more end uses. So the idea is that right now we have furnaces and gas-fired water heaters and vehicles that use gasoline or diesel. If we can electrify those things and simultaneously decarbonize our electricity supply, then that's a path toward decarbonizing our energy infrastructure. So today, actually, I want to actually just focus specifically on residential space and water heating and light duty vehicles, and acknowledge that like there's a lot of other stuff that has to get electrified as well. But so the focus today is just going to be thinking about, well, if we push hard on electrifying those things, what will the implications be for distribution systems? So we set out with a number of different questions. How much new distribution system capacity do we need to electrify end uses? The place where this stands in contrast to the first study that I was talking about is that now we're going to move beyond utility assessments for just sort of uniformly how much new load do they think can show up on a feeder, and actually look at these month hourly estimates of new load and lay onto that the load shapes that we think space and water heating would have, and under a range of different scenarios, electric vehicle charging would have. And so we're gonna kind of take control of those things, whereas before with the utility part, we were kind of just letting them make the assumptions on what those load shapes would look like. So we're still using the utility estimates on how much new capacity there is, or how much capacity is available, but we're kind of taking control at least of when and where the electric load shows up. Second question that we wanted to know is, can utilities address the needs for new capacity as it arises? So thinking about a few different scenarios, looking out to a 2050 timescale, how much work needs to get done? And can it be done fast enough to avoid interconnection delays? What will it cost? Simple question. And then this will be like a little bit of an afterthought at the end. What's the role of demand response or load flexibility in addressing, maybe giving some color to the nature of these questions? So a little bit less prior work to talk about here, but I think this is a very important, piece of knowledge that I think you all probably intuitively would know, is that distribution systems, actually, as we saw in the first part of the talk, there's wide variation in just the capacity of infrastructure, distribution infrastructure to host new electrified loads. And so the way that, and actually another thing that I should say is that this is from Alan Jen, who owns Alan. Some of you, I'm sure, know Alan. Right around the time we were finishing up this work, Alan, or is Hyland in here?
No.
Okay, good. Right around the time that we were finishing up our work, Alan and Hyland had this paper looking at sort of near-term needs for distribution system upgrades in PG&E using really interesting electric vehicle telemetry data and charging data. So with each one of these studies, like the key takeaway that informs how we're thinking about the next steps that I'll talk about here is that we have to have very location-specific analyses, and analyses that focus on scenarios, because like charging patterns matter a lot. That's one thing that we're going to say as we go through. Okay, so it's PG&E then will be the case study. This is stuff that you all probably know, but when I give this talk elsewhere, I highlight, I think, just kind of the staggering size of PG&E, almost 6 million customers, over 100,000 circuit miles of distribution lines. Cool fact, 1 in 6 EVs in the US are in PG&E service territory. And as we've already talked about, we've got lots of data available. So this is where our case study is, but it's a case study that we have to be careful generalizing because there's so much location-specific information. All right, so let me talk, I'm gonna quickly talk about this process, and maybe in Q&A we can come back to it if you guys wanna ask more. I'm gonna zoom in on each one of these, so you don't have to worry about reading this right here. As I said, the focus is light-duty EVs and residential space and water heating, what happens in different scenarios as we expand how much there is. A major part of this work, as it was with the first part, is integrating all of this information and modeling, energy systems modeling, and distribution grid capacity into a geospatial framework. So let me just go ahead. What I'm going to do is zoom in on this part, and this part, and this part, and this part. Up here, we're going to talk about space and water heating. Over here, we're going to talk about EVs. Then we're going to talk about integration into the distribution system. Okay, so how do we do the space and water heating part? Pulled together a whole bunch of different data that began with zip code level gas usage, monthly gas usage consumption, reported by PG&E. Then we also have from NREL just some estimates on the load shapes for space and water. So this is something that we did not directly measure. So we just assumed that, we were gonna take from other sources what those hourly load shapes might look like. We also have information on population density and the locations of those distribution feeders. And we can collapse all of those things down, making some assumptions about the coefficient of performance of the heat pump and the water heater to month-hour projected increases in electric load due to residential electrification. So it's a location specific because we start with that gas consumption and the load shapes. Location specific that's then connected to the locations of the feeders. We do something that's not as location specific with one exception that I'll talk about for the EVs. So we have from the California Energy Commission projections a few different scenarios for what EV charging demand might look like. So this is different from Alan's study where they're using actual recorded charging sessions. We're just working with a few different scenarios on what aggregate charging demand might look like on an hourly basis. And we map that to distribution feeder locations. The important part being that we know at these locations how many commercial and residential customers there are. So that at least allows us to toy around with the idea of the important differences between like a commercial charging load shape and a residential charging load shape, daytime dominated versus nighttime dominated. Okay, so then we pull all of that stuff together, basically just add up the electricity consumption by hour and location, and then map that onto these grid models. And this will be more for Q&A at the end because we have like even beyond the feeders, we know for each segment how much capacity is available. That enables us to get actually a distribution of possible integration amounts. And you'll see that show up in some of the results. We've got a distribution. And then that gives us an estimate. So we just compare how much new electricity load, how much does PG&E think is available, and then that tells us how much new capacity is needed per circuit. We did something similar on the substations, where again, we had substation transformer bank capacity by hour and do the same thing where we estimate the upgrade need. I'm gonna focus, because our results suggest that there's not as much needed on the distribution substations. I'm gonna focus more on the distribution line sections of the results. Okay, so residential heating, I'll quickly talk about this one because I want to get to EVs. We looked at a few different scenarios that came from National Renewable Energy Lab projections. This 43.5% high penetration in residential space and water heating, I think we started doing this probably 2 years ago now. And so this is something that I think, we're getting more ambitious and I think we could go a lot further here. But that's our high penetration scenario, just for your understanding. So then I'm plotting two things here. How much capacity, just in gigawatts, on the feeders is needed, how much new gigawatts of capacity needs to get added, and then just what's the count of the number of feeders or circuits that needs to get upgraded. And then you can see by year, according to these estimates for how quickly we're going to ramp up on electrification, and then with the reference to medium and high load growth scenarios. First thing to note here, and just in terms of power capacity needed, not much. And this, I've got this bigger y-axis limit because the EVs are going to be a different story. So how much new capacity in gigawatts is needed? Not much. How many circuits need to get upgraded? That's a little bit more. Out of 3,000 circuits roughly in PG&E service territory, this is saying just for space and water heating residential, about a third of them by 2050. Yeah.
Of the total capacity that's upgraded needed, what is that percentage of the total currently?
Right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have that number. Yeah. Okay, all right, here's where things change a little bit with EV. So the first thing I'll say is that here are our charging scenarios that come from the Energy Commission. You can see like a workplace charging scenario. This, let me make sure I'm saying this right. Yeah, the red one, yes. So the red one is a residential charging scenario. And then the blue is the total. So remember, we can put the workplace charging on commercial locations. You can put the residential charging at residential locations. And the key thing that I want to say here, and this I think is going to come out a little bit more a few times. Let's look over here. So this is high residential charging scenarios. So less happening at workplaces, more happening residentially. This is midnight. And in the assumptions that went into CEC's modeling, they just said, okay, everybody's gonna be on a time of use tariff where the price gets low at midnight. Everybody's gonna start charging. Okay, let me come over here. This is that scenario for new capacity. So it's not too surprising. Well, perhaps it's a little surprising that it's nighttime load that's driving the need for new capacity, but it's just so much. So this is like 3 gigawatts of demand. I forget exactly how this 3 gigawatt scales over here. Let's not pay too much attention to the y-axis here. We basically, we had to scale it to get to this sort of 2050 scenario. So that's why we have also in the first pass on the results, we did a really simple demand response scenario where we just said, okay, this is silly. Let's move that, just spread it out over the night. And that's what you can see this happening here, spread out and spread out. And that scenario is this light green one. So you can see that it makes a big difference in terms of how much capacity is needed. Check this out though. How many circuits need upgrading? It doesn't change. So in terms of how much work needs to get done, the demand response in this case doesn't really seem to matter. All of these scenarios, it doesn't seem to matter. It's like just like dig in and start working is what the conclusion would be based on. Is there a question? Yeah.
What was the assumption for a charging type for making those estimates?
Yeah, it's a diversity. So with the residential, it's a mix of level 1 and level 2. With the commercial, it's a mix of 1, 2, and then even DC fast charger. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had a question about that midnight peak.
Yeah.
Intuitively, I was thinking, shouldn't the projected demand at 11 p.m. more or less be close to the midnight demand? Like, why is it so low in the evening, but really high, like in the really early morning?
Again, I think if I'm understanding your question,
Yeah.
it's because even today, like the EV electricity rates, the price gets cheap at midnight.
Oh, at midnight,
Yeah.
it's just a cliff.
It's
Yeah.
even worse, it's way worse than that. Since 2012, when we started measuring it with the original Nissan Leafs and Volts, drivers tend to set their timer to midnight. Many more people than actually were on time of use rate were setting it for midnight, thinking that it's a good thing to do. So this is an artifact of actual measured charging loads in California in the last more than 10 years.
Interesting.
People are just saying, oh, midnight is a good time to start charging.
Default, yeah, in
Sounds
the
good.
vehicle, some of the vehicles are straight up default.
We will have more conversation about this. Okay, so then finally because I want to get through a few more parts. We can come back if you have questions on this. But we basically just put together some key scenarios where we combine, well, what if it's like commercial charging dominated versus residential, but plus the space and water heating addition, like what if we put all of those things together? I really just want you to kind of get a sense for how the scenarios can tend to matter. So like this one that's got the most need, the scenario B, it's EV charging, but without the demand response, and then lots of residential space and water heating. But we still see the same trend, like across all of these different scenarios, when we add in the residential heating, we still see that like the number of circuits that need to get upgraded is increasing. Okay, so just a couple of takeaways. All right, time of use rate design needs to evolve. More importantly, I think there's a really cool opportunity, and I'm sure you guys are thinking this, to say what are charging habits going to be? Not what will people just sort of default into their habits being, but like how do we actually define what charging habits should be? In my case, to benefit the grid, but there could be all kinds of reasons that we might want to shape what charging habits are. I also think this, we can go into this more toward the end. If you want, there's some, I think, intriguing results embedded in here that workplace charging, which intuitively I would have thought would be terrible because it's on peak, on circuits that are already, like you've got maybe lots of air conditioning load happening in commercial buildings. We're going to overload those circuits. The workplace charging actually doesn't result in significantly worse scenarios. And the reason that's appealing is because our energy is the cheapest in the middle of the day. And that's when it's low carbon. And so I think, strong emphasis, or what we see here is like, let's as much as possible be focusing on making those habits a workplace charging habit and putting in the charging infrastructure at workplaces. Next thing, just in terms of the number of projects. So here what we're looking at is just dividing the number of projects that we estimated by how many years we have to get there. And so the big kind of striking thing is by 2030, if you just look at how many projects need to happen for our 2030 scenarios between now and then, it's pushing about 200 feeders getting upgraded in PG&E per year. Historical average about 65 per year.
Just clarification, we're
Yes.
talking light duty only, is it?
This is only light duty.
I understand, it's way more than that.
Perhaps, because I think it depends where the medium and heavy duty stuff connects.
Yeah.
So like a lot of the heavy duty charging is gonna be like mainline straight into the transmission system. Yeah, go ahead.
And so just to clarify, with circuit upgrades, is it typically the feeder that's kind of like that hotspot when you look at the distribution?
And I should say, and I'll come back to this, this is per our analysis and our use of these data, but I'll come back to that in just a second. So, okay, acceleration in the pace of work. Going from something like historically 65 to pushing 200 projects per year. Not impacted much by rudimentary smart charging. I've got a quick slide that'll look at different smart charging scenarios in a second here. But let me just talk quickly about the median cost estimates. So we did a lot of work to pull in estimates of historical projects and lay that onto the size and type of projects that we see coming out of this analysis. Our estimate is that it's in the $5 billion range for the feeders. When you put in substations, it's more like $7 billion by 2050. It's a number with a B, it seems big, but we did just some simple like rate of return calculations for PG&E. And we think, we can get into this in Q&A, it works out to about 0.2 cents per kilowatt hour of added customer cost. I think it's a good investment. It's a small number, especially in the context of where now our rates are already untenably high, so maybe we shouldn't do anything to let the rates get higher. Maybe that's a debate we can have. Okay. I am gonna maybe just, rather than in the interest of time, I'm gonna just try to quickly talk about some of the smart charging stuff that we've done. The basic idea is we said, we actually have circuit level hourly available capacity data. Why not think about a world where we can get the EV charging to show up when and where we want it to, a totally idealized world, and simply for the purpose of minimizing how much new grid capacity is. And I'll acknowledge there could be a lot of other reasons that you might want to have some influence over when and where people are charging. And so we just did this like really simple optimization where we had some basic constraints. You can only do your commercial charging flexibility in the 9 to 5 window, residential charging in the 10 to 8 a.m. window. With COVID and people staying at home, I know you might want to debate that, but this is like kind of how we structured it. And then nothing moving into the peak hours of the day. Rather than, because I want to talk about just a couple of other things, rather than talking too much about the graphs, I'll just switch over those and we can come back to it in Q&A. The basic takeaway is that a little bit of smart charging goes a long way, in particular for reducing the near-term need for upgrades. But it doesn't have much impact on how many feeders eventually get upgraded. And that's because it's just like, it's just a ton of energy. And there's no amount of flexibility that makes it so that you avoid overloading these circuits. But in the short run, yes. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over those plots, we can come back to them if you want. So answers to key questions, key takeaway here on how much new capacity. In particular, it's I'll actually talk about this, the number of upgrades is quite striking according to our results. And we think it's a big acceleration in the pace of projects in PG&E. In terms of cost, I talked about this. We think ratepayer impacts are going to be small. If you can pay for all of that with the growth in load that's gonna come from light duty transportation and residential electrification, which is all we're focused on. And on demand response, it's important for spreading projects over time, but virtually everything needs to go. All right. In terms of recommendations, next steps, again, try not to generalize, it's just one utility. But we do think that this points to the need for longer planning horizons. That is, if you think about the status quo planning process, it's a 3-year horizon. You know, like, what do we need to do in the next 3 years? And with all of the work that needs to get done, I think it stands to reason that looking on a longer horizon and maybe bringing some of those projects forward to spread the work out over time is gonna work to the benefit of getting it all done in time. We think smart charging is important for balancing this stuff. Okay, here I think is a really important point, and this has been echoed by others, that there's a need to expand utility workforces for distribution capacity upgrades and start upgrades now. So let me actually talk about that a little bit more. So since we published this work, actually as we were putting it together and finishing things, a big consulting firm called Kabbalah started on a very similar study with secondary distribution transformer data, smart meter data for every single customer in all 3 of the investor-owned utilities in California. But essentially trying to answer the same questions, like their focus was how much is it gonna cost? They got a $50 billion number, but okay, one caveat, that's by 2035, which is, we got 5 or 7 billion by 2050. But all 3 investor-owned utilities, not just PG&E, and they included the secondary distribution transformers, which we didn't. Another thing they did is all of their EV charging was from 6 to 9 p.m. So, okay, that's gonna make a big difference on how much capacity is needed. So, I've been, like, it's been kind of fun for me to, I've been able to like get engaged with the PUC. I met with like the president of the PUC last week about this stuff. You know, they're recognizing that like smart charging is super important. Thinking about shaping when people are consuming is really important. There's another study though that just came out like a month ago from the Public Advocate's Office that suggested actually no, the pace of work doesn't need to grow at all. It's like completely different from these 2 other studies. They looked in detail at ours, and their conclusion was our results don't corroborate with no like further speculation as to why. And so I think we just have to, there's some kind of meeting of the minds that's gonna have to go on here to kind of square up the differences. But just thinking about now, it's been fun to see this kind of play out in the legislative process. So there were a bunch of hearings in Sacramento in the last 6 months or so. I testified about our work and talked about some other things. And just last month, SB 410 got signed. It's called the Powering Up of Californians Act. In particular, they've got this language: each electrical corporation must recruit, train, and retain an adequately sized qualified workforce, and to demonstrate that they're gonna be able to meet the upgrades that are needed over time. So it's cool to see that really starting to take shape. You know, did they quote our work in the bill? No, but I think, you know, we had like a little bit of a nudge in making this happen. I will note that the Public Advocate's Office, who had this result, opposed the bill. In part because it expands the ability for utilities to recover the costs, meaning that it could put upward pressure on utility rates, which is gonna make like the choice between an EV and a gas car harder. And so I think they reasonably opposed it, but I think in part because they're getting like very different results from others in terms of how much needs to happen. So it's an evolving story. Okay, I'll stop there because I think of the time and we can do some Q&A.
Right, questions?
Hey there, so going back to the residential electrification side, you mentioned that NREL has some kind of different case scenarios for like tech diffusion.
Yeah.
I was curious, do you know if NREL's models have any consideration for the type of heat pump or heat pump electric water heater that's being used, like a variable speed versus a single? You know, do you know if there's any considerations on that front?
There are, and I'm not gonna be able to say off the top of my head. I will say at least that we did run some early scenarios with different coefficients of performance on the water heaters and the heat pumps. Perhaps not surprisingly, because of these results, that the coefficient of performance didn't really give us any kind of a big, just keeping it within some sort of reasonable range of low to high. I forget exactly what it was like. At the top end, I think we're at maybe 4, COP of 4.
Because it makes it more linear rather than, I know with variable speed, you can get efficiency that would be like a non-linear. So I was.
Yeah, but if you think about like with the variable speed, it's really gonna benefit you when the demand is low. But like when you
When it's
ramp
high,
up to
it's
full
still-
power, it's gonna be just as it would for a.
We have a related question, I think, on the chat, which was whether this includes cooling requirements as well.
It does not include cooling requirements, and that's another really important piece of the puzzle, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that so about 70% of people in California now have cooling. So okay, 30% don't. If they all get heat pumps, what are they gonna do? Probably cool at certain times of year, but like you guys have a lot more cooling load than we do. But there are days when I would like to have an air conditioner in my house. I don't know what that would mean for whether those effects would dominate the estimates that we get from the heating side of things. The heating load is bigger than our cooling load, and in the places where there's not cooling already, the heating load is bigger.
Yeah.
So I'm totally shooting from the hip and speculating here, but I think if we were to include it, that the new air conditioners would probably not change the estimates. Now, what could change the estimates is climate change scenarios and growth in cooling demand in the places that already have. Yeah.
I had a question, I guess, on this same sort of vein. Was thinking about if maybe like the housing stock is going to improve, like I guess other things that might eliminate the need for heating, like you have better insulation and you have, better windows, housing stocks generally, getting newer. Do you think that is going to maybe reduce the heating demand for like the far future scenarios?
Yes, yeah, and in fact, so one thing I'll say is that a couple of other projects, we've been looking at like downscaled climate data for heating needs in a bunch of different climate scenarios. And although average temperatures, this is focused on California still, although average temperatures obviously are rising, the like extreme cold days are not projected to go away.
Right.
So those like peak heating events will likely still be present across a bunch of different climate change scenarios. And so I think that the efficiency's got some potential benefit there. At the same time, I will say that in California, I really think the story is about transportation.
Yeah.
In terms of at least the distribution grid impacts. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question about demand response on the supply side. So with
Yeah.
EVs, the timers on them right now are usually like, okay, let's say you said to midnight, boom, your charger 6 kilowatts, we're pulling 6 kilowatts till the battery's charged. Are we assuming in some of these models, like, do you think it'd be beneficial for the EV to actually vary load hour by hour? And
Yeah.
especially during the day when there's loads, have it serve as supply for the grid?
Okay, so let me talk about the demand side first. So I'll get to go into a bit more detail on this slide that I glossed over. So actually, I'll start here to keep it digestible. So this is so here's an example scenario that we looked at with the smart charging, where we said, okay, what if we live in a world where everybody charges with these just commercially? It's an extreme scenario, but we wanted to, I'll show you a few different other options. and just using those energy commission load shapes, how much circuit upgrade would there need to be if there's no flexible charging? And that's what these numbers are here on the y-axis, on the y-axis. And the colors are the year, 2030, 2040, 2050. And then we said, okay, what if 25% of the energy needs for electric vehicles can be shifted to any hour in the commercial charging window, 9 to 5. And so this is like a very extreme version, I think, of what you're asking, which is like, what if somebody's got like full control over when people are charging, but just 25% people? And then so you can see what's the, and so it's like filling in the kind of valleys, if you will. It's not just saying like 6 kW or not. And so on this one, what you can see is that, okay, there's, as I said before, there's this big benefit to the first sort of chunk of flexible charging, but then it kind of levels out. But you also see that that benefit is not as big in the future years. Now here we looked at like, well, 75% commercial, 25% residential mix, 25% commercial, 75% residential, and then all residential. And you can see it's a similar story, but lots more benefit happening in these kind of mixed scenarios. But again, reduced benefit going up.
Yeah, and I mean, would we be doing this by just, okay, like EVA is charging right now, EVB is not, or would it be more, more software integration with the manufacturers?
Yeah, I think there's a,
Does that matter?
I don't have a good answer on this one, because it's not like my core area. But I think you could do it in both ways, right? It's like if you want to limit your charging demand to 100 kilowatts, but you've got like 200 kilowatts of EV potential demand, we could have half of them charge at their full, or you could have all of them charge at half. I think that, yeah, that's, I'm agnostic as to which one we should do. Yeah, I'm gonna, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on the generalization of this kind of distribution level studies, although you said don't generalize.
Yeah.
Just curious, since results of this level studies has very high spatial heterogeneities. So what do you think California's story mean to other places in the world, since this is a global trend of electrification?
The way I frame it is like if there's a broader story outside of California, it's make these kinds of data publicly accessible, and make sure that utilities are thinking in the long term. And so it may well be that there are utilities, parts of the world where they've got just buckets of excess capacity and they don't need to worry about it, but like be deliberate about confirming that that's the case.
Okay.
That's how I would say it.
Thank you.
Okay.
So between 3 studies, your study, Public Advocates, Kabbalah, separate of the results, what do you think about the different methodologies? Maybe just between the Public Advocates and Kabbalah study, the methodology that they used to, and of course, maybe we adjust like the load curves, right? So it's maybe more realistic or integrate some, load management. How do you think about their 2 approaches? Is there one? Because the Public Advocates Office says it's 26 billion in today's dollar bill. By 2035, it's actually 48 billion. It's like, well, that's pretty close to the same as what Kabbalah said, right? Like, and so do you fall on one side or another in terms of the approach of it, right? Maybe tune it here, tune it there, but
I think I don't have enough, I haven't spent enough time with the Public Advocates Office to really weigh in on that.
Sure.
In terms of how we approach things and how Kabbalah and the Public Advocates Office approach things, that's different is that we used a slightly different data set for the feeders of this integration capacity analysis, where they use something called the grid needs assessment data. So there are some differences between those two. and some of the differences might be coming from that. But I think that at least between our work and the Kavala work, I spent a long time in the Kavala study. And I think the key difference is just like, what's your assumption about when the demand is showing up? Yeah. With the, so these are like really idealized scenarios in terms of how smart charging can reduce the need for new upgrades. Is this enough to close the gap between our initial findings and the public advocate's office findings? No, there's still even less.
Yeah.
So there's other like things that need to get squared up here. But we're all using, kind of back to your initial concern, which I think is totally valid. Like we're all using like the outputs of utility models, their sort of assessments of like hourly available capacity to make this work. And so if I could choose how this should move forward, I would say, okay, the utilities, they have the expertise to be running these models, but we need, I think this is a familiar refrain, like we need analysts at this Public Utilities Commission that are in really tight conversation and have the power systems engineering knowledge with the IOUs to make sure that like these longer run projections are credible and everybody sort of understands like the implications of assumptions and all of that. I think it's been really fun to participate like kind of on the sidelines as this independent researcher, but I don't think that should be the model going forward. Like it has to happen with the experts. Okay, good.
First, great presentation and great walk. So really enjoy seeing it and kind of really connected to what we're doing every day. So it's great. So I will have a comment and then a question going to take you way out of your comfort zone. The comment is that on your blue lines,
Yeah.
the piece that is kind of always missing is the cost of added infrastructure.
Yeah.
Like you need way more chargers and everyone needs to be connected all the time so you can actually play the game. And the other option is to connect once every 3 or 4 days to a charger for a few hours, charge as fast as you can and go on. And then we will need much less charging EVSE part and more upgrade to the distribution network. And we need to kind of weigh the cost of both options to say where we want to put the investment. And right now, I haven't seen anyone that do it, to actually think about the balance between the investment in the charger side to the investment in the distribution side. We can start one.
Okay.
But my question is, as someone who sits on the sidelines, do you think that we have the policy tools to fix it on time to get the amount of EVs we need? Or do you feel that we need new legislation, new tools that we don't have in our toolbox right now, PUC and so
on? I think I'm genuinely concerned that there is a non-negligible probability that that there's going to be wide-scale adoption of electric vehicles, and utilities are going to say, we can't take it. And I think that I do think that's possible. Even with some recent, I think, really good movement on the legislative side, and with the PUC, doing their best to stay on top of this. I hope the Public Advocate's Office is right, honestly. I hope I'm wrong for the decarbonization goals.
unfortunately, I think that you're right. So.
Is there room for more legislation? I think that yes, but and I've been really impressed with how much has already happened. Like, I would never have guessed that there would be like a series of legislative hearings on the distribution system in Sacramento. Like, and lawmakers like understanding these issues, like that's really cool. Is it gonna be enough? I don't know, but like we've got a lot of people working on it, so hopefully. I will say like one, I'm gonna be very curious to see how the publicly owned utilities address this versus the investor.
Your job, Billy.
We don't have the data to evaluate where they're at, but you know, perhaps you guys have seen like the differences in electricity tariffs already. Like there's already something different that's happening in the publicly owned utilities in California. Maybe it's just because of where they're located and they don't have like 100-mile feeders through the Sierra Nevada, but I'll be curious to see how they. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Yeah, so do you think that like heavy use of EVs on level 3 charging instead of level 2, like I'm thinking the renter owner problem, not having charging at home.
Yeah.
How much do you think that's gonna throw a wrench in the whole problem?
I think it's potentially a solution to the problem, honestly. Like coming back to some of the stuff we were talking about before, if you have level 3 chargers that are connecting directly to the transmission system, and essentially like building their own already infrastructure to make that connection, then we don't have to worry about any of this distribution stuff. But that's okay, that kind of comes back to this, like, what are the habits we're gonna have people sort of assume, or like, how will we have people assume they should charge up their cars? Is it a, okay, you stop every 3 or 4 days and you do a level 3 charging session? That won't have the distribution, I think, the distribution grid implications. But it's still not gonna be a gasoline pumping session, it's gonna take a little bit more time.
Yeah, because it's not just distribution, it's also supply side too.
Yeah, so on the supply side, right, another whole set of issues there. I think there's, yeah, I'm not gonna speculate on this one. I will just say, like, I'm keeping my eye on how much new energy storage we have showing up and what's gonna happen with offshore wind. Because I think that those two things could pretty easily address the supply side. But it's not, I haven't actually done that study.
We had one more question.
Yeah, sorry to kind of pull it back to something else, but so in creating these models and understanding plugging in light duty vehicles, is there some sort of proportion or assumption that a lot of these vehicles, let's say you have multi-EV households,
Yeah.
that they're not going to be taken to work, that they're actually going to be staying in the garage and be doing more kind of errand trips rather than going back and forth from a work setting?
Yeah.
Is there a way to incorporate that into models, and has that already been done?
I don't, with this style of study, that has certainly not been done. I can imagine there'd be a lot of ways to do it.
Because I feel like some EVs may never touch a corporate parking lot, you know?
We are pushing the CC to include daytime domestic charging, home charging. Because 60% of the people not commute with their cars. Or 60% of the cars are not being used for that.
60% of the EVs,
No,
or 60% of all cars.
Right now, 60% of the EVs are being used for commute,
Okay,
but only 40% of the cars in California. So if the EVs will become more and more like the general vehicles in California, we'll have less and less of them. Right now, 60% of them commute, in the future, 40% of them commute.
yeah.
All
Okay.
right, well, I'm gonna bring it to a close here.